Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Chelsea McGee, and this is The Real 411. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a crisis that's dominating headlines, but as always, the story is so much more than the headline. It's June 2025. Missiles are raining down on Tehran. Israeli hospitals are getting hit by cyber attacks, and the world is basically holding its breath. Netanyahu says it's all about security. Iran's leaders are vowing revenge, but let's be real. Civilians are the ones paying the price, as usual. I've treated families who fled these conflicts before, and I can tell you, the trauma doesn't just disappear when the bombs stop. So let's dig into what's really going on with this so-called necessary war. Because as you know, if you've listened to this show before, the truth is always more complicated. So how did we get to this point? Honestly, it's a long, tangled history. Decades of nuclear ambitions, proxy wars, and covert operations. Israel and Iran have been locked in this shadow war for years, trading cyber attacks, assassinations, and sabotage. But things really started to unravel after the collapse of nuclear diplomacy. Remember, we talked about this back in episode 3, when the nuclear deal was hanging by a thread. Well, that thread snapped. In June 2025, Israel launched a surprise barrage of attacks on Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. And that was the spark that set off this latest round of open hostilities. I still remember treating Iranian American refugees during the 2023 border crisis, families who'd lost everything, caught between governments playing chess with real people's lives. That's the human cost of these geopolitical games, and it's only gotten worse. What we're seeing now is a new kind of war, one that's both high-tech and brutally personal. Israel's strikes have hit more than 100 major targets in Iran, including nuclear facilities like Natanz and Fordo, missile sites, and even the Defense Ministry headquarters in Tehran. They've killed top military commanders and nuclear scientists. Iran's response? Hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones fired at Israeli cities, Tel Aviv, Haifa, you name it. Civilians on both sides are scrambling for cover, and the death toll keeps climbing. Israel claims it's crippling Iran's nuclear program. But here's the thing. A lot of these facilities are buried deep underground. Even the experts say that unless the U.S. gets involved with those massive bunker buster bombs, Israel can only delay, not destroy, Iran's nuclear capabilities. And every strike just risks fueling more escalation. So, can Israel really achieve its goal? Or are we just setting the stage for the next round of violence? I'm not sure anyone has a good answer to that. Now, let's talk about the big players circling this conflict. The U.S. and Russia are both in the mix, and their moves could tip the whole region into something even more dangerous. President Trump left the G7 summit early to deal with the crisis, and he's been making some pretty wild statements, threatening Iran's supreme leader, promising full strength and might if the U.S. is attacked, but also saying he wants a real end to Iran's nuclear ambitions, not just a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Russia's Putin is offering to mediate, but also condemning Israel's attacks as illegal. China and Europe are mostly calling for restraint and diplomacy, but they're also worried about energy security. Because if this thing spreads, oil prices and global markets could go haywire. The risk of a wider Middle East war is real, and every move by these superpowers is like a domino. One wrong push, and the whole thing could topple. Speaking of oil, let's talk about the economic fallout. The Strait of Hormuz is this tiny choke point where about 20% of the world's oil passes through. And right now, traders and governments are on edge. Oil prices have surged 12% since June 13th. And that's not just a number on a screen. It means higher gas prices, more expensive flights, and inflation that hits everyone everywhere. Stock markets have taken a hit, currencies are wobbling, and safe haven assets like gold are rallying. If Iran decides to block the strait, or if Israel targets Iran's oil export facilities, we could see a real global shock. And honestly, with all the uncertainty, investors are nervous and central banks are rethinking their plans. It's not just a regional crisis, it's a global one, and it's already hitting people's wallets. But let's not lose sight of the human dimension. Civilians are always the ones who suffer most. In Tehran, people are stuck in traffic jams trying to flee, gas stations are packed, and there's panic everywhere. Israel's strikes have killed over 200 civilians in Iran, including at least 20 children, according to Iranian sources. Iran's missile attacks have killed at least 24 civilians in Israel and wounded hundreds more. There's no warning, no air raid sirens in Tehran, just bombs falling in the middle of the night. Public opinion is mixed. In Iran, most people are angry at their own government for not protecting them, but they're also terrified of more war. In Israel, there's support for the government's actions, but also fear and exhaustion. Protests and rallies are breaking out in both countries, and people are just trying to hold on to some sense of normalcy. Over 600 foreign nationals have been evacuated from Iran in the last few days, and every family caught in the crossfire has a story. Stories that rarely make the headlines. So, is there any hope for diplomacy? There have been some attempts, back-channel talks, calls for ceasefires, and international pressure. The UN Security Council met at Iran's request, and countries like Russia, Qatar, and Jordan are pushing for negotiations. But the reality is, both sides are dug in. Israel says it won't stop until Iran's nuclear program is dismantled. Iran says it won't negotiate under fire. The U.S. is sending mixed signals, sometimes talking about peace, sometimes threatening more strikes. Sanctions and economic incentives are on the table, but it's not clear if they'll move the needle. The key actors, Israel, Iran, the U.S., Russia, China, and regional powers like Egypt and the Gulf states all have their own interests, and getting them to agree on anything is, well, let's just say it's a long shot. But if there's any path to peace, it's going to take real pressure, creative diplomacy, and probably a lot of luck. So, what could actually help de-escalate this mess? First, there's talk of a UN-backed ceasefire with real verification, something that both sides would have to actually stick to, not just sign and ignore. Regional powers like Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf Cooperation Council could step in as mediators, using their influence to get Israel and Iran to the table. There's also the idea of targeted sanctions relief and developmental aid, but only if there are real, tangible steps toward de-escalation. It's not just about punishing or rewarding. It's about creating incentives for both sides to step back from the brink. But, and this is a big but, none of this works unless there's trust. And right now, trust is in very short supply. Still, these are the levers the international community has. And if there's any hope, it's going to come from a combination of pressure, incentives, and maybe some outside-the-box thinking. Now, let's not forget the digital battlefield. Cyber warfare is playing a huge role in this conflict. We've seen cyber attacks cripple Israeli hospitals, disrupt communications, and target critical infrastructure on both sides. Israel and Iran have been trading cyber blows for years, but now it's out in the open. The risk is that a major cyber attack could escalate things even further. Imagine if power grids go down or military systems get hacked in the middle of a shooting war. There's some talk about trying to establish cyber ceasefires or at least some norms to keep things from spiraling out of control. But honestly, that's a whole new frontier. The digital domain is just as real as the physical one, and it's making this conflict even more unpredictable. All right, that's it for today's episode of The Real 411. If you want clear-eyed reporting on conflict, power, and propaganda, make sure you subscribe. And if you know someone who's just repeating the headlines without the context, share this episode with them. I want to hear from you too. Do you think this is about defense, deterrence, or is it something even more dangerous? Because as we always say here, the story is never just the headline. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you next time.